Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to Test 2 Plus today. I am Trace. This is episode 5 of 5 on our series on terrorism. If you haven't watched the other 4, please go back and watch those because they're great, but also so you can understand a little bit more about how we got to this conclusion. Also, you can tune in and listen to the whole thing on iTunes, so make sure you check that out. There's a link in the description if you want to download from iTunes. But how do terrorist groups end? Terrorist groups are pretty much synonymous with humanity throughout history. They've been around for a long, long time. But what happens when they are done? What happens after? In the past, the media has used classifications to talk about the end of terrorism. External repression is one. Internal collapse is another. Public rejection, or simply they succeeded in their goals. A study by RAND used data since 1968, and it suggests that former extremist groups joined the political process 43% of the time. The IRA is a great example of this. They joined into the British government, and now they're working internally to make change. Local police and intelligence agencies arrested or killed the key members of the group 40% of the time. And military forces are rarely the primary reason for the end of any terrorist group. Very few groups within this time frame have ever achieved victory. Make sure you listen to yesterday's episode if you haven't. We talk all about that. So what does this mean? It means that military forces usually have the opposite effect on terrorist groups from what is intended. Often military forces come in a little too heavy-handed. It's overused. It alienates the local population. It increases terrorist group recruitment in that local area. Not to mention, there's propaganda problems. The British government avoids using the phrase war on terror because the phrase suggests that there's a battlefield solution to the problem of terrorism, which we know is not true. Basically, when you look at the data, terrorist groups survive 8 years on average, and it's usually a pretty grim end, like the death of one of its leaders. Sometimes terrorist groups end because they've been classified differently, or sometimes they were never terrorist groups in the first place. We do a poor job classifying what a terrorist group is. I mentioned earlier that terrorist is used kind of hyperbolically. It's almost a joke now to say something like, well, if you buy a hot dog and you're on a diet, the terrorists win. Like, we're using this as a joke, but terrorists are classified. They're a group of people that we look at and we say, okay, you're a terrorist, you're not a terrorist. Usually we classify them based on the tactics the person or group uses, or that's how we should be classifying them. For example, bombings, kidnappings, basically anything that is designed to scare innocent people, attack civilians. Terrorism's basic premise is to create fear, terror. But instead, it seems like we often use the word terrorists not for a specific classification, but for people or groups who are taking action against our governments. And it's not us specifically, like the United States, but a lot of different governments look at groups and say, you're a terrorist because you're attacking us. And we don't know your political affiliation, or you don't have a country affiliation, so you're a terrorist. Let me put it this way. Sometimes who is a terrorist depends on who's in power and who's saying they're terrorists. For example, the MEK, or MEK, as I'm going to call them, was or is a terrorist group operating out of Iraq. They were cited by the Bush administration as one of the reasons that we should invade Iraq post 9/11. They were known to attack Iran and its regime, and in a publication the Bush administration put out on why we should invade Iraq, they wrote, Iraq shelters terrorist groups, including the Mujahideen-e-Khalq organization, MKO, aka MEK, which has used terrorist violence against Iran and in the 1970s was responsible for killing several U.S. military personnel and U.S. civilians. The Iranian government blames the MEK for the deaths of more than 12,000 Iranians over the past 3 decades. Except when it was no longer politically convenient, they were no longer considered a terrorist group. It's reported that U.S. intelligence organizations have trained MEK members on American soil for years. And even better than that, the group operates a well-funded, highly sophisticated network of advocates in the U.S. They have support of high-profile candidates from both political parties, like Rudolph Giuliani, former governors of various states like Howard Dean, Edward Rendell, and much of the support was to delist the MEK as a terrorist organization, and that worked. In 2012, Hillary Clinton removed the group from the U.S. terrorist list and unfroze the MEK's U.S. assets, allowing them to transact with U.S. allies. So this was a terrorist group that is no longer a terrorist group. But it's only that way because we classified it differently. Whether their actions have changed is different. But a lot of what we do with terrorism comes down to politics. Terrorist groups come and go. They're popular for a time, and then maybe they end. Maybe they seize power somewhere, and then they lose that power. But in the end, it seems, based on research and data, they never achieve their goals, and terrorism is sort of part of humanity. Why? Because we terrorize when we feel oppressed. And when it doesn't work out, many terrorist groups end up joining the movement of the wider society to try and affect real change, or maybe they just fade away. We talk about terrorism a lot today because it gets clicks, it gets ratings, and it's more important to keep apprised, or so we think. Terrorism is going to be here. It's going to be here for a long time, and it is a matter of concern. No one should be downplaying that terrorism doesn't affect people in their lives, but to imply that we can fight terrorism into the grave, that we can be victorious over terrorism, is short-sighted at best and ignorant at worst. It's not going to go away. Instead, maybe we should understand where that oppression comes from and try and cure those feelings of oppression, help those people who feel oppressed have a better say in their political environment, help them affect change without having to resort to violence. That's just my opinion, of course. It's a lot more complicated than that. So why don't you tell us your opinion down in the comments? And thanks for watching Test Tube Plus. We hope you come back tomorrow and see more of us. If you'd like to subscribe, we would appreciate it. And let us know what you think down in the comments of all of our shows. Thanks for watching. I'm Trace. Come back tomorrow for our newest series on fear. Kind of important. It's a big deal. See you later.